A Passage in the Life of Mr. Watkins Tottle. Chapter the Second. "The first coach has not come in yet, has it, Tom?" inquired Mr. Gabriel Parsons, as he very complacently paced up and down the 14 feet of gravel which bordered the lawn on the Saturday morning which had been fixed upon for the Beulah Spa jaunt. "No, sir, I haven't seen it," replied a gardener in a blue apron, who let himself out to do the ornamental for half-a-crown a day and his keep. "Time Tottle was down," said Mr. Gabriel Parsons, ruminating. "Oh, here he is, no doubt," added Gabriel, as a cab drove rapidly up the hill, and he buttoned his dressing gown and opened the gate to receive the expected visitor. The cab stopped, and out jumped a man in a coarse Petersham greatcoat, whitey brown neckerchief, faded black suit, gambage-colored top boots, and one of those large crowned hats formerly seldom met with, but now very generally patronized by gentlemen and costermongers. "Mr. Parsons," said the man, looking at the superscription of a note he held in his hand, and addressing Gabriel with an inquiring air. "My name is Parsons," responded the sugar baker. "I've brought this here note," replied the individual in the painted tops, in a hoarse whisper. "I've brought this here note from a gentleman as come to our house this morning." "I expected the gentleman at my house," said Parsons, as he broke the seal, which bore the impression of Her Majesty's profile as it is seen on a sixpence. "No doubt the gentleman would have been here," replied the stranger, "if he hadn't happened to call at our house first. But we never trusts no gentleman further than we can see him. No mistake about that there," added the unknown, with a facetious grin. "Beg your pardon, sir. No offence meant only once in, and I wish you may. Catch the idea, sir?" Mr. Gabriel Parsons was not remarkable for catching anything suddenly, but a cold. He therefore only bestowed a glance of profound astonishment on his mysterious companion, and proceeded to unfold the note of which he had been the bearer. Once opened, the idea was caught with very little difficulty. Mr. Watkins Tottle had been suddenly arrested for £33, 10 shillings 4pence, and dated his communication from a lock-up house in the vicinity of Chancery Lane. "Unfortunate affair, this," said Parsons, refolding the note. "Oh, nothing ven you're used to it," coolly observed the man in the Petersham. "Tom," exclaimed Parsons, after a few minutes' consideration, "just put the horse in, will you? Tell the gentleman that I shall be there almost as soon as you are," he continued, addressing the sheriff officer's Mercury. "Very well," replied that important functionary, adding, in a confidential manner, "I did wise the gentleman's friend to settle. You see, it's a mere trifle, and unless the gentleman means to go up before the court, it's hardly worthwhile waiting for detainers, you know. Our governor's wide awake, he is. I'll never say nothing agin him, nor no man, but he knows what's o'clock, he does. Uncommon." Having delivered this eloquent, and to Parsons particularly intelligible harangue, the meaning of which was eked out by divers nods and winks, the gentleman in the boots reseated himself in the cab, which went rapidly off, and was soon out of sight. Mr. Gabriel Parsons continued to pace up and down the pathway for some minutes, apparently absorbed in deep meditation. The result of his cogitations seemed to be perfectly satisfactory to himself, for he ran briskly into the house, said that business had suddenly summoned him to town, that he had desired the messenger to inform Mr. Watkins Tottle of the fact, and that they would return together to dinner. He then hastily equipped himself for a drive, and mounting his gig, was soon on his way to the establishment of Mr. Solomon Jacobs, situate, as Mr. Watkins Tottle had informed him, in Cursitor Street, Chancery Lane. When a man is in a violent hurry to get on, and has a specific object in view, the attainment of which depends on the completion of his journey, the difficulties which interpose themselves in his way appear not only to be innumerable, but to have been called into existence especially for the occasion. The remark is by no means a new one, and Mr. Gabriel Parsons had practical and painful experience of its justice in the course of his drive. There are 3 classes of animated objects which prevent your driving with any degree of comfort or celerity through streets which are but little frequented. They are pigs, children, and old women. On the occasion we are describing, the pigs were luxuriating on cabbage stalks, the shuttlecocks floated from the little deal battledores, and the children played in the road. And women, with a basket in one hand and the street door key in the other, would cross just before the horse's head until Mr. Gabriel Parsons was perfectly savage with vexation, and quite hoarse with hoying and imprecating. Then, when he got into Fleet Street, there was a stoppage, in which people and vehicles have the satisfaction of remaining stationary for half an hour, and envying the slowest pedestrians, and where horses policemen rush about, and seize hold of horses' bridles and back them into shop windows by way of clearing the road and preventing confusion. At length, Mr. Gabriel Parsons turned into Chancery Lane, and having inquired for and been directed to Cursitor Street, for it was a locality of which he was quite ignorant, he soon found himself opposite the house of Mr. Solomon Jacobs. Confiding his horse and gig to the care of one of the 14 boys who had followed him from the other side of Blackfriars Bridge on the chance of his requiring their services, Mr. Gabriel Parsons crossed the road and knocked at an inner door, the upper part of which was of glass, grated like the windows of this inviting mansion with iron bars, painted white to look comfortable. The knock was answered by a sallow-faced, red-haired, sulky boy, who, after surveying Mr. Gabriel Parsons through the glass, applied a large key to an immense wooden excrescence, which was in reality a lock, but which, taken in conjunction with the iron nails with which the panels were studded, gave the door the appearance of being subject to warts. "I want to see Mr. Watkins Tottle," said Parsons.
"Is the gentleman that come in this morning, Jim?"
screamed a voice from the top of the kitchen stairs, which belonged to a dirty woman who had just brought her chin to a level with the passage floor.
"The gentleman's in the coffee room."
"Upstairs, sir," said the boy, just opening the door wide enough to let Parsons in without squeezing him, and double-locking it the moment he had made his way through the aperture.
"First floor, door on the left."
Mr. Gabriel Parsons, thus instructed, ascended the uncarpeted and ill-lighted staircase, and after giving several subdued taps at the before-mentioned door on the left, which were rendered inaudible by the hum of voices within the room, and the hissing noise attendant on some frying operations which were carrying on below stairs, turned the handle and entered the apartment. Being informed that the unfortunate object of his visit had just gone upstairs to write a letter, he had leisure to sit down and observe the scene before him. The room, which was a small, confined den, was partitioned off into boxes, like the common room of some inferior eating-house. The dirty floor had evidently been as long a stranger to the scrubbing brush as to carpet or floor-cloth, and the ceiling was completely blackened by the flare of the oil lamp by which the room was lighted at night. The grey ashes on the edges of the tables, and the cigar ends which were plentifully scattered about the dusty grate, fully accounted for the intolerable smell of tobacco which pervaded the place, and the empty glasses and half-saturated slices of lemon on the tables, together with the porter pots beneath them, bore testimony to the frequent libations in which the individuals who honored Mr. Solomon Jacobs by a temporary residence in his house indulged. Over the mantel-shelf was a paltry-looking glass, extending about half the width of the chimney-piece, but by way of counterpoise, the ashes were confined by a rusty fender about twice as long as the hearth. From this cheerful room itself, the attention of Mr. Gabriel Parsons was naturally directed to its inmates. In one of the boxes, 2 men were playing at cribbage with a very dirty pack of cards, some with blue, some with green, and some with red backs. Selections from decayed packs. The cribbage board had been long ago formed on the table by some ingenious visitor with the assistance of a pocket-knife and a 2-pronged fork, with which the necessary number of holes had been made in the table at proper distances for the reception of the wooden pegs. In another box a stout, hardy-looking man of about 40 was eating some dinner which his wife, an equally comfortable-looking personage, had brought him in a basket. And, in a third, a genteel-looking young man was talking earnestly and in a low tone to a young female whose face was concealed by a thick veil, but whom Mr. Gabriel Parsons immediately set down in his own mind as the debtor's wife. A young fellow of vulgar manners, dressed in the very extreme of the prevailing fashion, was pacing up and down the room with a lighted cigar in his mouth and his hands in his pockets, ever and anon puffing forth volumes of smoke, and occasionally applying, with much apparent relish, to a pint-pot, the contents of which were chilling on the hob.
"4 more, by gum!"
exclaimed one of the cribbage players, lighting a pipe and addressing his adversary at the close of the game.
"When to think you got luck in a pepper cruet, and shook it out when you wanted it." "Oh, that ain't a bad un," replied the other, who was the horse dealer from Islington.
"No, I'm blessed if it is," interposed the jolly-looking fellow, who, having finished his dinner, was drinking out of the same glass as his wife, in truly conjugal harmony, some hot gin and water. The faithful partner of his cares, had brought a plentiful supply of the anti-temperance fluid in a large, flat stone bottle, which looked like a half-gallon jar that had been successfully tapped for the dropsy.
"You're a rum chap, you are, Mr. Walker. Will you dip your beak into this, sir?"
"Thank ye, sir," replied Mr. Walker, leaving his box and advancing to the other to accept the proffered glass.
"Here's your health, sir, and your good woman's here. Gentlemen all, yours, and better luck still. Well, Mr. Willis," continued the facetious prisoner, addressing the young man with a cigar, "you seem rather down today. Floored, as one may say. What's the matter, sir? Never say die, you know."
"Oh, I'm all right," replied the smoker. "I shall be bailed out tomorrow."
"Shall you, though?" inquired the other. "Damn me, I wish I could say the same. I am as regularly over head and ears as the Royal George, and stand about as much chance of being bailed out. Ha 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 ha!"
"Why, look at me. What do you think I've stopped here 2 days for?" "'Cause you couldn't get out, I suppose," interrupted Mr. Walker, winking to the company. "Not that you're exactly obliged to stop here. Only you can't help it. No compulsion, you know. Only you must, eh?"
"Ain't he a rum 'un?" inquired the delighted individual, who had offered the gin and water of his wife. "Oh, he just is," replied the lady, who was quite overcome by these flashes of imagination.
"Why, my case," frowned the victim, throwing the end of his cigar into the fire, and illustrating his argument by knocking the bottom of the pot on the table at intervals. "My case is a very singular one. My father's a man of large property, and I am his son."
"That's a very strange circumstance,"
interrupted the jocose Mr. Walker, en passant. "I am his son, and have received a liberal education. I don't owe no man nothing, not the value of a farthing. But I was induced, you see, to put my name to some bills for a friend. Bills to a large amount, I may say a very large amount, for which I didn't receive no consideration. What's the consequence?
Right, I suppose the bills went out, and you came in. The acceptances weren't taken up, and you were, eh?" inquired Walker.
"To be sure," replied the liberally educated young gentleman. "To be sure. And so here I am, locked up for a matter of £1,200.
"Why don't you ask your old governor to stump up?" inquired Walker,
with a somewhat skeptical air. "Oh, bless you, he'd never do it," replied the other, in a tone of expostulation. "Never."
"Well, it's very odd, to be sure," interposed the owner of the flat bottle, mixing another glass. "But I've been in difficulties, as one may say, now for 30 a year. I went to pieces when I was in a milk walk 30 years ago. Afterwards, when I was a fruiterer and kept a spring wan, and out of that again in the coal and tater line. But all that time, I never see a youngish chap come into a place of this kind who wasn't going out again directly, and who hadn't been arrested on bills which he'd given a friend and for which he'd received nothing whatsoever, not a fraction."
"Oh, it's always the cry," said Walker.
"I can't see the use on it. That's what makes me so wild. Why, I should have a much better opinion of an individual if he'd say at once in an honourable and gentlemanly manner as he'd done everybody he possibly could."
"Aye, to be sure," interposed the horse-dealer, with whose notions of bargain and sale the axiom perfectly coincided. "So should I." The young gentleman who had given rise to these observations was on the point of offering a rather angry reply to these sneers, but the rising of the young man before noticed, and of the female who had been sitting by him to leave the room, interrupted the conversation. She had been weeping bitterly, and the noxious atmosphere of the room, acting upon her excited feelings and delicate frame, rendered the support of her companion necessary as they quitted it together. There was an air of superiority about them both, and something in their appearance so unusual in such a place, that a respectful silence was observed until the whir-bang of the spring door announced that they were out of hearing. It was broken by the wife of the ex-fruiterer.
"Poor creature,"
said she, quenching a sigh in a rivulet of gin and water.
"She is very young."
"She's a nice-looking woman, too," added the horse-dealer.
"What's she in for, Ikey?"
inquired Walker of an individual who was spreading a cloth with numerous blotches of mustard upon it on one of the tables, and whom Mr. Gabriel Parsons had no difficulty in recognizing as the man who had called upon him in the morning.
"Vy," responded the factotum, "it's one of the rummiest rigs you ever heard on. It come in here last Wednesday, which, by the by, is a-going over the water tonight. Howsoever, that's neither here nor there. You see, I've been a-going backwards and forwards about his business, and I've managed to pick up some of his story from the servants and them. And so far as I can make it out, it seems to be somewhat to this here effect."
"Cut it short, old fellow," interrupted Walker, who knew from the former experience that he of the top boots was neither very concise nor intelligible in his narratives.
"Let me alone," replied Ikey, "and now I wound up and made my lucky in 5 seconds. This here young gentleman's father, so I'm told, mind ye, and the father of the young woman, have always been very bad, out and out, regularly knocking me down sort of terms. But somehow or another, when he was a visiting at some gentlefolk's house, as he knowed at college, he came into contact with a young lady. He seed her several times, and then he up and said he'd keep company with her, if so be as she was agreeable. Well, she was as sweet upon him as he was upon her, and so I suppose they made it all right, for they got married about 6 months afterwards, unbeknown, mind ye, to the two fathers. Leastways, so I'm told. When they heard on it, my eyes, there was such a combustion. Starvation was the very least that was to be done to him. The young gentleman's father cut him off with a bob, because he'd got himself off with a wife. And the young lady's father, he behaved even worser and more unnatural, for he not only blowed her up dreadful, and swore he'd never see her again, but he employed a chap as I knows, and you knows, Mr. Walker, a precious sight too well, to go about and buy up the bills and them things, on which the young husband, thinking his governor had come round again, had raised the vind just to blow himself on with for a time. Besides which, he made all the interest he could to set other people agin him. Consequence was, that he paid as long as he could, but things he never expected to have to meet till he had had time to turn himself round, come fast upon him, and he was nabbed. He was brought here, as I said afore, last Wednesday, and I think there's about half a dozen detainers agin him downstairs now. I have been, added Ikey, in the profession these 15 year, and I never met with such vindictiveness afore. Poor creatures, exclaimed the coal dealer's wife once more, again resorting to the same excellent prescription for nipping a sigh in the bud. Ah, when they've seen as much trouble as I and my old man here have, they'll be as comfortable under it as we are. The young lady's a pretty creature, said Walker, only she's a little too delicate for my taste. There ain't enough of her. As to the young cove, he may be very respectable and what not, but he's too down in the mouth for me. He ain't game. Game? Exclaimed Ikey, who had been altering the position of a green-handled knife and fork at least a dozen times, in order that he might remain in the room under the pretext of having something to do. He's game enough when there's anything to be fierce about. But who could be game, as you call it, Mr. Walker, with a pale young creature like that hanging about him? It's enough to drive any man's heart into his boots, to see him together, and no mistake at all about it. I never shall forget her first coming here. He wrote to her on the Thursday to come. I know he did, 'cause I took the letter. Uncommon fidgety he was all day, to be sure. And in the evening he goes down into the office, and he says to Jacob, says he, Sir, can I have the loan of a private room for a few minutes this evening, without incurring any additional expense, just to see my wife in? Says he. Jacobs looks as much as to say, strike me bountiful if you ain't one of the modest sort. But as the gentleman who had been in the back parlour had just gone out, and had paid for it for that day, he says, Weddergrave, Sir, he says, it's again our rules to let private rooms to our lodgers on gratis terms. But, says he, for a gentleman, I don't mind breaking through them for once. So then he turns round to me and says, Ikey, put 2 mould candles in the back parlour and charge them to this gentleman's account, which I did. Well, by and by, a hackney coach comes up to the door, and there, sure enough, was the young lady, wrapped up in a hopper cloak, as it might be, and all alone. I opened the gate that night, so I went up, and the coach came, and he was a-waiting at the parlour door, and wasn't he a-trembling neither. The poor creature saw him, and could hardly walk to meet him. Oh, Harry, she says, that it should have come to this, and all for my sake, says she, putting her hand upon his shoulder. So he puts his arm round her pretty little waist, and leading her gently a little way into the room, so that he might be able to shut the door, he says so kind and soft-like, Why, Kate, says he. Here's the gentleman you want, said Ikey, abruptly breaking off the story and introducing Mr. Gabriel Parsons to the crestfallen Watkins Tottle, who at that moment entered the room. Watkins advanced with a wooden expression of passive endurance, and accepted the hand which Mr. Gabriel Parsons held out. I want to speak to you, said Gabriel, with a look strongly expressive of his dislike of the company. This way, implied the imprisoned one, leading the way to the front drawing-room, where rich debtors did the luxurious at the rate of a couple of guineas a day. Well, here I am, said Mr. Watkins, as he sat down on the sofa, and placing the palms of his hands on his knees, anxiously glanced at his friend's countenance. Yes, and how you're likely to be, said Gabriel coolly, as he rattled the money in his unmentionable pockets, and looked out of the window. What's the amount of the costs? Inquired Parsons, after an awkward pause. Have you any money? 9 and 6pence halfpenny. Mr. Gabriel Parsons walked up and down the room for a few seconds, before he could make up his mind to disclose the plan he had formed. He was accustomed to drive hard bargains, but was always most anxious to conceal his avarice. At length he stopped short and said, Tottle, you owe me £50. I do, and from all I see, I infer that you are likely to owe it to me. I fear I am. Though you have every disposition to pay me if you're good?
Certainly.
Then, said Mr. Gabriel Parsons, listen, here's my proposition. You know my way of old. Accept it, yes or no. I will or I won't. I'll pay the debts and costs and lend you £10 more, which, added to your annuity, will enable you to carry on the war well, if you'll give me your note of hand to pay me £150 within 6 months after you are married to Miss Lillerton. My dear, stop a minute. On one condition, and that is that you propose to Miss Lillerton at once.
At once? My dear Mr. Parsons, consider.
It's for you to consider, not me. She knows you well from reputation, though she did not know you personally until lately. Notwithstanding all her maiden modesty, I think she'd be devilish glad to get married out of hand with as little delay as possible. My wife has sounded her on the subject, and she has confessed.
What? Eagerly interrupted the enamored Watkins.
Why, replied Parsons, to say exactly what she has confessed would be rather difficult, because they only spoke in hints and so forth. But my wife, who is no bad judge in these cases, declared to me that what she had confessed was as good as to say that she was not insensible to your merits. In fact, that no other man should have her.
Mr. Watkins Tottle rose hastily from his seat and rang the bell.
What's that for? Inquired Parsons.
I want to send the man for the bill stamp, replied Mr. Watkins Tottle.
Then you've made up your mind?
I have. And they shook hands most cordially. The note of hand was given. The debt and costs were paid. Ike was satisfied for his trouble, and the two friends soon found themselves on that side of Mr. Solomon Jacobs's establishment, on which most of his visitors were very happy when they found themselves once again. To wit, the outside.
Now, said Mr. Gabriel Parsons, as they drove to Norwood together, you shall have an opportunity to make the disclosure tonight, and mind you speak out, Tottle.
I will, replied Watkins valorously.
How should I like to see you together? Ejaculated Mr. Gabriel Parsons. What fun!
And he laughed so long and so loudly that he disconcerted Mr. Watkins Tottle and frightened the horse.
There's Fanny and your intended walking about on the lawn, said Gabriel, as they approached the house. Mind your eye, Tottle.
Never fear, replied Watkins resolutely, as he made his way to the spot where the ladies were walking.
Here's Mr. Tottle, my dear, said Mrs. Parsons, addressing Miss Lillerton.
The lady turned quickly round and acknowledged his courteous salute with the same sort of confusion that Watkins had noticed on their first interview, but with something like a slight expression of disappointment or carelessness.
Did you see how glad she was to see you? Whispered Parsons to his friend.
Why, I really thought she looked as if she would rather have seen somebody else, replied Tottle.
Pooh, nonsense, whispered Parsons again. It's always the way with women, young or old. They never show how delighted they are to see those whose presence makes their hearts beat. It's the way with the whole sex, and no man should have lived to your time of life without knowing it. Fanny confessed it to me when we were first married, over and over again. See what it is to have a wife.
Certainly, whispered Tottle, whose courage was vanishing fast.
Well, now, you'd better begin to pave the way, said Parsons,
who, having invested some money in speculation, assumed the office of director. Yes, I will, presently, replied Tottle, greatly flurried.
Say something to her, man, urged Parsons again.
Confound it! Pay her a compliment, can't you? No, not till after dinner, replied the bashful Tottle, anxious to postpone the evil moment.
Well, gentlemen, said Mrs. Parsons, you are really very polite. You stay away the whole morning after promising to take us out, and when you do come home, you stand whispering together and take no notice of us.
We were talking of the business, my dear, which detained us this morning, replied Parsons, looking significantly at Tottle.
Dear me, how very quickly the morning has gone, said Miss Lillerton, referring to the gold watch, which was wound up on state occasions, whether it required it or not. I think it has passed very slowly, mildly suggested Tottle.
That's right. Bravo, whispered Parsons.
Indeed, said Miss Lillerton, with an air of majestic surprise. I can only impute it to my unavoidable absence from your society, madam, said Watkins, and that of Mrs. Parsons. During this short dialogue, the ladies had been leading the way to the house.
What the deuce did you stick Fanny into that last compliment for? Inquired Parsons, as they followed together. It quite spoilt the effect.
Oh, it really would have been too broad without, replied Watkins Tottle. Much too broad.
He's mad, Parsons whispered to his wife, as they entered the drawing-room. Mad from modesty.
Dear me, ejaculated the lady. I never heard of such a thing. You'll find we have quite a family dinner, Mr. Tottle, said Mrs. Parsons, when they sat down to table. Miss Lillerton is one of us, and, of course, we make no stranger of you.
Mr. Watkins Tottle expressed a hope that the Parsons family never would make a stranger of him, and wished internally that his bashfulness would allow him to feel a little less like a stranger himself.
"Take off the covers, Martha,"
said Mrs. Parsons, directing the shifting of the scenery with great anxiety. The order was obeyed, and a pair of boiled fowls, with tongue and etceteras, were displayed at the top, and a fillet of veal at the bottom. On one side of the table, 2 green sauce tureens, with ladles of the same, were setting to each other in a green dish, and on the other was a curried rabbit, in a brown suit, turned up with lemon.
"Miss Lillerton, my dear," said Mrs. Parsons, "shall I assist you?"
"Thank you, no. I think I'll trouble Mr. Tottle." Watkins started, trembled, helped the rabbit, and broke a tumbler. The countenance of the lady of the house, which had been all smiles previously, underwent an awful change. "Extremely sorry," stammered Watkins, assisting himself to curry and parsley and butter, in the extremity of his confusion.
"Not in the least consequence,"
replied Mrs. Parsons, in a tone which implied that it was of the greatest consequence possible, directing aside the researches of the boy, who was groping under the table for the bits of broken glass. "I presume," said Miss Lillerton, "that Mr. Tottle is aware of the interest which bachelors usually pay in such cases. A dozen glasses for one is the lowest penalty." Mr. Gabriel Parsons gave his friend an admonitory tread on the toe. Here was a clear hint that the sooner he ceased to be a bachelor and emancipated himself from such penalties, the better. Mr. Watkins Tottle viewed the observation in the same light, and challenged Mrs. Parsons to take wine with a degree of presence of mind which, under all the circumstances, was really extraordinary.
"Miss Lillerton," said Gabriel, "may I have the pleasure?"
"I shall be most happy."
"Tottle, will you assist Miss Lillerton and pass the decanter? Thank you."
The usual pantomimic ceremony of nodding and sipping gone through.
"Tottle, were you ever in Suffolk?"
inquired the master of the house, who was burning to tell one of his 7 stock stories.
No, responded Watkins, adding, by way of a saving clause, but I've been in Devonshire.
Ah, replied Gabriel, it was in Suffolk that a rather singular circumstance happened to me many years ago. Did you ever happen to hear me mention it?
Mr. Watkins Tottle had happened to hear his friend mention it some 400 times. Of course, he expressed great curiosity, and evinced the utmost impatience to hear the story again. Mr. Gabriel Parsons forthwith attempted to proceed in spite of the interruptions to which, as our readers must frequently have observed, the master of the house is often exposed in such cases. We will attempt to give them an idea of our meaning.
When I was in Suffolk, said Mr. Gabriel Parsons.
Take off the fowls first, Martha,
said Mrs. Parsons.
I beg your pardon, my dear.
When I was in Suffolk, resumed Mr. Parsons,
with an impatient glance at his wife, who pretended not to observe it,
which is now years ago, business led me to the town of Bury St. Edmunds. I had to stop at the principal places in my way, and therefore, for the sake of convenience, I travelled in a gig. I left Sudbury one dark night. It was winter time, about 9 o'clock. The rain poured in torrents. The wind howled among the trees that skirted the roadside, and I was obliged to proceed at a foot pace, for I could hardly see my hand before me. It was so dark—
John, interrupted Mrs. Parsons, in a low, hollow voice, don't spill that gravy.
Fanny, said Parsons impatiently, I wish you'd defer these domestic reproofs to some more suitable time. Really, my dear, these constant interruptions are very annoying.
My dear, I didn't interrupt you,
said Mrs. Parsons. But, my dear, you did interrupt me, remonstrated Mr. Parsons.
How very absurd you are, my love. I must give directions to the servants. I'm quite sure that if I sat here and allowed John to spill the gravy over the new carpet, you'd be the first to find fault when you saw the stain tomorrow morning.
Well, continued Gabriel with a resigned air, as if he knew there was no getting over the point about the carpet,
I was just saying, it was so dark that I could hardly see my hand before me. The road was very lonely, and I assure you, Tottle,
this was a device to arrest the wandering attention of that individual, which was distracted by a confidential communication between Mrs. Parsons and Martha, accompanied by the delivery of a large bunch of keys.
I assure you, Tottle, I became somehow impressed with a sense of the loneliness of my situation.
Pie to your master, interrupted Mrs. Parsons,
again directing the servant.
Now pray, my dear,
remonstrated Parsons once more, very pettishly. Mrs. P. turned up her hands and eyebrows, and appealed in dumb show to Miss Lillerton.
As I turned a corner of the road, resumed Gabriel, the horse stopped short and reared tremendously. I pulled up, jumped out, ran to his head, and found a man lying on his back in the middle of the road, with his eyes fixed on the sky. I thought he was dead, but no, he was alive, and there appeared to be nothing the matter with him. He jumped up, and putting his hand to his chest,
and fixing upon me the most earnest gaze you can imagine, exclaimed, "Pudding here," said Mrs. Parsons. "Oh, it's no use," exclaimed the host, now rendered desperate. "Here, Tottle, a glass of wine. It's useless to attempt relating anything when Mrs. Parsons is present." This attack was received in the usual way. Mrs. Parsons talked to Miss Lillerton and at her better half, expatiated on the impatience of men generally, hinted that her husband was peculiarly vicious in this respect, and wound up by insinuating that she must be one of the best tempers that ever existed, or she never could put up with it. Really, what she had to endure sometimes was more than anyone who saw her in everyday life could by possibility suppose. The story was now a painful subject, and therefore Mr. Parsons declined to enter into any details, and contented himself by stating that the man was a maniac who had escaped from a neighboring madhouse. The cloth was removed, the ladies soon afterwards retired, and Miss Lillerton played the piano in the drawing-room overhead very loudly for the edification of the visitor. Mr. Watkins, Tottle, and Mr. Gabriel Parsons sat chatting comfortably enough until the conclusion of the second bottle, when the latter, in proposing an adjournment to the drawing-room, informed Watkins that he had converted a plan with his wife for leaving him and Miss Lillerton alone soon after tea. "Don't you think it would be better if we put it off till tomorrow?" "Don't you think it would have been much better if I had left you in that wretched hole I found you in this morning?" retorted Parsons bluntly. "Well, well, I only made a suggestion," said poor Watkins Tottle, with a deep sigh. Tea was soon concluded, and Miss Lillerton, drawing a small work table on one side of the fire, and placing a little wooden frame upon it, something like a miniature clay mill without the horse, was soon busily engaged in making a watch-guard with brown silk. "God bless me!" exclaimed Parsons, starting up with well-feigned surprise. "I've forgotten those confounded letters. Tottle, I know you'll excuse me." If Tottle had been a free agent, he would have allowed no one to leave the room on any pretense, except himself. As it was, however, he was obliged to look cheerful when Parsons quitted the apartment. He had scarcely left, when Martha put her head into the room with, "Please, ma'am, you're wanted." Mrs. Parsons left the room and shut the door carefully after her, and Mr. Watkins Tottle was left alone with Miss Lillerton. For the first 5 minutes there was a dead silence. Mr. Watkins Tottle was thinking how he should begin, and Miss Lillerton appeared to be thinking of nothing. The fire was burning low. Mr. Watkins Tottle stirred it, and put some coals on. "Hem," coughed Miss Lillerton. Mr. Watkins Tottle thought the fair creature had spoken. "I beg your pardon," said he. I thought you spoke." "No." "Oh." "There are some books on the sofa, Mr. Tottle, if you would like to look at them," said Miss Lillerton, after the lapse of another 5 minutes. "No, thank you," returned Watkins. And then he added, with a courage which was perfectly astonishing, even to himself, "Madam, that is Miss Lillerton, I wish to speak to you." "To me?" said Miss Lillerton, letting the silk drop from her hands, and sliding her chair back a few paces. "Speak? To me?" "To you, madam, and on the subject of the state of your affections." The lady hastily rose, and would have left the room, but Mr. Watkins Tottle gently detained her by the hand, and holding it as far from him as the joint length of their arms would permit, he thus proceeded. "Pray do not misunderstand me, or suppose that I am led to address you, after so short an acquaintance, by any feeling of my own merits. For merits I have none which could give me a claim to your hand. I hope you will acquit me of any presumption when I explain that I have been acquainted through Mrs. Parsons with the state, that is, that Mrs. Parsons has told me, at least, not Mrs. Parsons, but—" Here Watkins began to wonder, but Miss Lillerton relieved him. "Am I to understand, Mr. Tottle, that Mrs. Parsons has acquainted you with my feeling, my affection, I mean my respect, for an individual of the opposite sex?" "She has." "Then what," inquired Miss Lillerton, averting her face with a girlish air, "what could induce you to seek such an interview as this? What can your object be? How can I promote your happiness, Mr. Tottle?" Here was the time for a flourish. "By allowing me," replied Watkins, falling bump on his knees, and breaking 2 brace buttons and a waistcoat string in the act. "By allowing me to be your slave, your servant. In short, by unreservedly making me the confidant of your heart's feelings. May I say, for the promotion of your own happiness. May I say, in order that you may become the wife of a kind and affectionate husband." "Disinterested creature!" exclaimed Miss Lillerton, hiding her face in a white pocket handkerchief with an eyelet-hole border. Mr. Watkins Tottle thought that if the lady knew all, she might possibly alter her opinion on this last point. He raised the tip of her middle finger ceremoniously to his lips, and got off his knees as gracefully as he could. My information was correct?" he tremulously inquired, when he was once more on his feet. "It was." Watkins elevated his hands and looked up to the ornament in the center of the ceiling, which had been made for a lamp, by way of expressing his rapture. "Our situation, Mr. Tottle," resumed the lady, glancing at him through one of the eyelet holes, "is a most peculiar and delicate one." "It is," said Mr. Tottle. "Our acquaintance has been of so short duration," said Miss Lillerton. "Only a week," assented Watkins Tottle. "Oh, more than that," exclaimed the lady, in a tone of surprise. "Indeed?" said Tottle. "More than a month. More than 2 months," said Miss Lillerton. "Rather odd, this," thought Watkins. "Oh," he said, recollecting the parson's assurance that she had known him from report. "I understand. But, my dear madam, pray consider. The longer this acquaintance has existed, the less reason is there for delay now. Why not at once fix a period for gratifying the hopes of your devoted admirer? It has been represented to me again and again that this is the course I ought to pursue," replied Miss Lillerton. "But pardon my feelings of delicacy, Mr. Tottle. Pray excuse this embarrassment. I have peculiar ideas on such subjects, and I am quite sure that I never could summon up fortitude enough to name the day to my future husband." "Then allow me to name it," said Tottle eagerly. "I should like to fix it myself," replied Miss Lillerton bashfully, "but I cannot do so without at once resorting to a third party." "A third party?" thought Watkins Tottle. "Who the deuce is that to be, I wonder?" "Mr. Tottle," continued Miss Lillerton, "you have made a most disinterested and kind offer. That offer I accept. Will you at once be the bearer of a note from me to Mr. Timpson?" "Mr. Timpson?" said Watkins. "After what has passed between us," responded Miss Lillerton, still averting her head, "you must understand whom I mean. Mr. Timpson, the clergyman." "Mr. Timpson, the clergyman?" ejaculated Watkins Tottle, in a state of inexpressible beatitude, and positive wonder at his own success. "Angel! Certainly, this moment!" "I'll prepare it immediately," said Miss Lillerton, making for the door. "The events of this day have flurried me so much, Mr. Tottle, that I shall not leave my room again this evening. I will send you the note by the servant." Stay, cried Watkins Tottle, still keeping a most respectful distance from the lady. "When shall we meet again?" "Oh, Mr. Tottle," replied Miss Lillerton, coquettishly, "when we are married, I can never see you too often, nor thank you too much." And she left the room. Mr. Watkins Tottle flung himself into an armchair, and indulged in the most delicious reveries of future bliss, in which the idea of £500 per annum, with an uncontrolled power of disposing of it by her last will and testament, was somehow or other the foremost. He had gone through the interview so well, and it had terminated so admirably, that he almost began to wish he had expressly stipulated for the settlement of the annual 500 on himself. "May I come in?" said Mr. Gabriel Parsons, peeping in at the door. "You may," replied Watkins. "Well, have you done it?" anxiously inquired Gabriel. "Have I done it?" said Watkins Tottle. "Hush! I'm going to the clergyman." "No!" said Parsons. "How well you have managed it." "Where does Timpson live?" inquired Watkins. "At his uncle's," replied Gabriel, "just round the lane. He's waiting for a living, and has been assisting his uncle here for the last 2 or 3 months." "But how well you have done it! I didn't think you could carry it off so." Mr. Watkins Tottle was proceeding to demonstrate that the Richardsonian principle was the best on which love could possibly be made, when he was interrupted by the entrance of Martha, with a little pink note folded like a fancy cocked hat. "Miss Lillerton's compliments," said Martha, as she delivered it into Tottle's hands, and vanished. "Do you observe the delicacy?" said Tottle, appealing to Mr. Gabriel Parsons. "Compliments. Not love by the servant, eh?" Mr. Gabriel Parsons didn't exactly know what reply to make, so he poked the forefinger of his right hand between the 3rd and 4th ribs of Mr. Watkins Tottle. "Come," said Watkins, when the explosion of mirth consequent on this particular jest had subsided. "We'll be off at once. Let's lose no time." "Capital," echoed Gabriel Parsons, and in 5 minutes they were at the garden gate of the villa tenanted by the uncle of Mr. Timpson. "Is Mr. Charles Timpson at home?" inquired Mr. Watkins Tottle of Mr. Charles Timpson's uncle's man. "Mr. Charles is at home," replied the man, stammering, "but he desired me to say he couldn't be interrupted, sir, by any of the parishioners." "I am not a parishioner," replied Watkins. "Is Mr. Charles writing a sermon, Tom?" inquired Parsons, thrusting himself forward. "No, Mr. Parsons, sir. He's not exactly writing a sermon, but he is practicing the violoncello in his own bedroom, and gave strict orders not to be disturbed." "Say I'm here," replied Gabriel, leading the way across the garden. "Mr. Parsons and Mr. Tottle on private and particular business." They were shown into the parlor, and the servant departed to deliver his message. The distant groaning of the violoncello ceased, footsteps were heard on the stairs, and Mr. Timpson presented himself and shook hands with Parsons with the utmost cordiality. "How do you do, sir?" said Watkins Tottle, with great solemnity. "How do you do, sir?" replied Timpson, with as much coldness as if it were a matter of perfect indifference to him how he did, as it very likely was. "I beg to deliver this note to you," said Watkins Tottle, producing the cocked hat. "From Miss Lillerton," said Timpson, suddenly changing colour. "Pray sit down." Mr. Watkins Tottle sat down, and while Timpson perused the note, fixed his eyes on an oyster-sauce-coloured portrait of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which hung over the fireplace. Mr. Timpson rose from his seat when he had concluded the note, and looked dubiously at Parsons. "May I ask," he inquired, appealing to Watkins Tottle, "whether our friend here is acquainted with the object of your visit?" "Our friend is in my confidence," replied Watkins, with considerable importance. "Then, sir," said Timpson, seizing both Tottle's hands, "allow me in his presence to thank you most unfeignedly and cordially for the noble part you have acted in this affair." "He thinks I recommended him," thought Tottle. "Confound these fellows. They never think of anything but their fees." "I deeply regret having misunderstood your intentions, my dear sir," continued Timpson. "Disinterested and manly indeed. There are very few men who would have acted as you have done." Mr. Watkins Tottle could not help thinking that this last remark was anything but complimentary. He therefore inquired, rather hastily, "When is it to be?" "On Thursday," replied Timpson. "On Thursday morning at 8:30. "Uncommonly early," observed Watkins Tottle, with an air of triumphant self-denial. "I shall hardly be able to get down here by that hour." This was intended for a joke. "Never mind, my dear fellow," replied Timpson, all suavity, shaking hands with Tottle again most heartily. "So long as we see you to breakfast, you know." "Eh?" said Parsons, with one of the most extraordinary expressions of countenance that ever appeared in a human face. "What?" ejaculated Watkins Tottle at the same moment. "I say that so long as we see you to breakfast," replied Timpson, "we will excuse your being absent from the ceremony, though, of course, your presence at it would give us the utmost pleasure." Mr. Watkins Tottle staggered against the wall, and fixed his eyes on Timpson with appalling perseverance. "Timpson," said Parsons, hurriedly brushing his hat with his left arm, "when you say us, whom do you mean?" Mr. Timpson looked foolish in his turn, when he replied, "Why, Mrs. Timpson that will be this day week. Miss Lillerton, that is." "Now don't stare at that idiot in the corner!" angrily exclaimed Parsons, as the extraordinary convulsions of Watkins Tottle's countenance excited the wondering gaze of Timpson, "but have the goodness to tell me in 3 words the contents of that note." "This note," replied Timpson, "is from Miss Lillerton, to whom I have been for the last 5 weeks regularly engaged. Her singular scruples and strange feelings on some points have hitherto prevented my bringing the engagement to that termination which I so anxiously desire. She informs me here that she sounded Mrs. Parsons with a view of making her confidant and go-between, and that Mrs. Parsons informed this elderly gentleman, Mr. Tottle, of the circumstance, and that he, in the most kind and delicate terms, offered to assist us in any way, and even undertook to convey this note, which contains the promise I have so long sought in vain, an act of kindness for which I can never be sufficiently grateful." "Good night, Timpson," said Parsons, hurrying off and carrying the bewildered Tottle with him. Won't you stay and have something?" said Timpson. "No, thank you," replied Parsons. "I've had quite enough." And away he went, followed by Watkins Tottle, in a state of stupefaction. Mr. Gabriel Parsons whistled until they walked some quarter of a mile past his own gate, when he suddenly stopped and said, "You are a clever fellow, Tottle, ain't you?" I don't know," said the unfortunate Watkins.
"I suppose you'll say this is Fanny's fault, won't you?" inquired Gabriel.
I don't know anything about it," replied the bewildered Tottle.
"Well," said Parsons, turning on his heel to go home, "the next time you make an offer, you had better speak plainly, and don't throw a chance away. And the next time you're locked up in a sponging house, just wait there till I come and take you out. There's a good fellow."
How or at what hour Mr. Watkins Tottle returned to Cecil Street is unknown. His boots were seen outside his bedroom door next morning,
but we have the authority of his landlady for stating that he neither emerged therefrom nor accepted sustenance for 24 hours. At the expiration of that period, and when a council of war was being held in the kitchen on the propriety of summoning the parochial beadle to break his door open, he rang his bell and demanded a cup of milk and water. The next morning, he went through the formalities of eating and drinking as usual, but a week afterwards he was seized with a relapse while perusing the list of marriages in a morning paper, from which he never perfectly recovered. A few weeks after the last named occurrence, the body of a gentleman unknown was found in the Regent's Canal. In the trousers pockets were 4 shillings and 3 halfpenny, a matrimonial advertisement from a lady, which appeared to have been cut out of a Sunday paper, a toothpick, and a card case, which it is confidently believed would have led to the identification of the unfortunate gentleman, but for the circumstance of there being none but blank cards in it. Mr. Watkins Tottle absented himself from his lodgings shortly before. A bill, which has not been taken up, was presented next morning, and a bill, which has not been taken down, was soon afterwards affixed in his parlor window.